Time Bandits was not a typical children's film. It was odder, edgier, more daring, and much more disturbing than the standard family fantasy of the time. Under the clothes and the comedy lay a risk that might have been lost. A child star who disappeared after this movie, outlaws who weren't mere actors but images of their performers, and a sequel that slipped through fingers repeatedly like loot grabbed away from grasp. Buried within the maps and the craziness lay a tale never intended to remain secure. Every map hides a price, and this one bled to be read. What follows are 20 facts about Time Bandits, but together they tell a larger tale of accidents, triumphs, failures, and a cult legacy that continues to haunt cinema decades later. If this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who should hear it. Let's get started. The first fact begins with Terry Gilliam's refusal to make Time Bandits just another piece of fantasy fluff. He did not want another slick fairy tale with pristine heroes and sound morals. He envisioned a film that children could love for its adventure, but overlaid with satire biting enough for adults. He once described it as a kids' movie for adults and an adult movie for kids. That contradiction influenced the whole movie. Rather than noble heroes, he presented us with greedy, quarreling dwarves who were mirrors to the selfishness of adults. Instead of a neat moral, he gave us an ending where Kevin's parents casually explode after touching pure evil. Children laughed in disbelief, adults winced in horror. Gilliam believed children understood darkness better than most filmmakers admitted, and that grown-ups secretly longed for the wonder they had lost. Time Bandits tiptoed along a tightrope, a children's bedtime story sheathed in surreal comedy, with a subtle truth about how we become adult and lose something on the way. Michael Palin and Gilliam did not dream, when they wrote the screenplay, that they'd be signing up a superstar. In reality, Agamemnon's part had been tongue-in-cheek described in the script as resembling Sean Connery, or someone of roughly equal but lower-cost stature. It was intended as a joke. Gilliam had planned to cast a budget substitute, but life had other plans. Connery himself read the script, chuckled at the joke, and accepted the role. James Bond was suddenly cutting up Greek legend in a children's fantasy. His gravitas lent the film unexpected heft, particularly during sweet moments when he guides Kevin. What had started out as an offhand line became one of fantasy movie casting's most memorable coups. Connery wasn't acting, he was nearly spoofing his own icon in-between while taking the film far above its humble station. The six bandits themselves weren't simply comic foils careening through history. They bore the burden of yet another galaxy far, far away. David Rappaport was Randall, the boisterous, domineering leader. At his side were Jack Purvis and Kenny Baker, two thespians already canonized by Star Wars. Purvis had been in every film of the original trilogy, starting out as a Jawa in A New Hope and graduating to an Ewok in Return of the Jedi. Baker, naturally, was the fellow dressed inside R2-D2, the whistling pulse of George Lucas's space fantasy. On the Time Bandits set, the two laughed over the irony. They had moved from laser fight scenes and spaceship battles to ladders, maps, and Gilliam's hallucinatory comedy. For audiences watching years later, the crossover was a revelation. Here was a Monty Python fantasy covertly staging a reunion of Lucasfilm alumni. The robbers weren't stealing only treasures of history. They were carrying concealed portions of another pop culture legend. That collision of two worlds made Time Bandits crazier than anyone could imagine. Casting Kevin, however, was the real risk. The entire film rested on an 11-year-old being able to juggle history, comedy, and mayhem without grating. Initially, Gilliam believed he discovered the solution in Craig Warnock's older brother, who sang with a confident and energetic flourish. But Gilliam's focus wavered. Unobtrusive in the waiting room, sitting in silence, was Craig himself. Shy, reserved, nearly invisible, Craig wasn't acting, he just was. Gilliam asked him to read, and within minutes he knew. Craig didn't overshadow the craziness around him, he anchored it. His quiet intelligence and honesty provided the heart to the story. Kevin wasn't the loudest fellow in the room. He was the silent core, making everything else credible. Craig Warnock was just 11 when he was at the center of Time Bandits. His inherent stillness provided the heft to the movie. He wasn't groomed, he wasn't flashy, but his integrity grounded Gilliam's mad vision. And then, poof, he disappeared. Warnock never came back to Hollywood after the film, opting for a more sedate existence in music. That absence turned his performance into a miracle, an isolated burst of childhood candor captured eternally on screen. Kevin is not only a character, but the boy who showed up once, earthed fantasy, and then disappeared. Warnock was not the only gamble, however. Hollywood did not want Time Bandits. Studios rejected Gilliam's idea, surreal quest, dwarves, time portals, and child hero, and moved on. Too weird, too English, too unmerchandisable. One person thought differently: George Harrison. His company Handmade Films funded the film with property backing, risking Harrison's own money. He had already rescued Monty Python's Life of Brian when everyone else would not. With Time Bandits, he went further, even writing and recording the closing song, Dream Away. Without Harrison's faith, the Bandits never would have stolen time at all. And they did it on a mere $5 million. To Hollywood, that was small change. Gilliam made every dollar count with smoke and mirrors and cleverness. Castles were miniature sets. Armies were hinted at by staging. Giants came from the sea with rigs and tricks of perspective, and costumes were reused. What appeared to be a vast blockbuster was actually a magician's sleight of hand. People never saw the edges. Gilliam's sets, however, were hazardous. On one stunt, Gilliam attempted to placate the crew by jumping off a scaffold himself. He underestimated and struck Shelley Duvall, who had just been through the psychological torture of The Shining. The incident left her with enduring nerve damage. For Gilliam, it was a wake-up call that his freeform worldview, Prove It Live, had actual consequences. For Duvall, it was another agonizing sacrifice required by fantasy. Monty Python DNA permeated every corner. Gilliam's co-writer, Michael Palin, couldn't help but get in front of the lens, ad-libbing and cringeworthy suitor subplot with Duvall. His stammering charm became a surprise level of comedy. Similarly, Gilliam used all his experience in cutout animation to imagine tumbling through holes in reality, ragged apertures that engulfed the bandits whole, surreal and handmade rather than hi-fi. Even the last battle was like that of a child's imagination. Kevin's toys grew into real armies, Lego-like walls, chessboards, cowboys, archers, and even spaceships, all clashing on evil's battlefield. Gilliam and Palin did not conjure quirks for the bandits from thin air, but borrowed them from the actors themselves. Rappaport was brusque and quick-witted, Kenny Baker soft-spoken and kind, others wicked or timid. Their actual tensions seeped into the script, bringing a truth most fantasy sidekicks don't possess. They were not archetypes. They were actual people, sometimes petty, sometimes faithful, and always at odds. That texture provided Time Bandits with its peculiar magic. Gilliam considered the film to be the initial chapter of a trilogy of imagination, followed by Brazil, adulthood, and the adventures of Baron Munchausen, old age. Separately, the three investigated the transformation of imagination throughout life. It was, however, Time Bandits, with its combination of boyish enchantment and grown-up satire, that proved the introduction. And it finished with a bang. Literally, Kevin's parents blow up, and he is left by himself among the wreckage. Parents in 1981 were appalled. Gilliam would not soften it. Kids already understood that adults made dumb decisions, he claimed. Why pretend? The studio pleaded with him to modify it, but he would not give in. That nasty scar of an ending made the movie unforgettable, a fairy tale with fangs. Critics scoffed, studios mocked it, even the cast feared that it would fail. But in 1981, Time Bandits took in over $42 million worldwide, almost 9 times its cost. Children came for adventure, adults remained for satire, and word of mouth created a boom. Against all odds, Gilliam's craziest vision turned into his biggest success. But sequels became cursed. Gilliam and Palin wrote a full script in 1996. Financing collapsed. Hallmark announced a lavish miniseries. It vanished. A comic book continuation was teased in 2006. The publisher folded on release day. Every attempt slipped away, like the map itself. Fans began to think the story didn't want to be continued. But the Bandits did make it into Marvel Comics in 1981, with John Stokes depicting their wild romp through history. For children, the comic was the sole means of reliving the movie, thumbing through pages in which Connery, Rappaport, and Baker coexisted with Spider-Man and the X-Men. Decades on, prints were treasured as collectors' items. By the 2000s, Time Bandits existed largely on grainy VHS tapes. Its DIY magic faded. Then Criterion restored it in 2014, frame by frame, restoring its colors and textures to dazzling brilliance. No longer a cult oddity, it was now a restored classic set beside the greats of cinema. And still, the accursed sequel myth lived on. In 2024, Apple TV Plus debuted a return by Taika Waititi, Jermaine Clement, and Ian Morris. Practical effects, otherworldly vitality, old-fashioned craftsmanship, it held some potential. But it was axed after one season, too costly with too little audience. The vision of continuation faded once more. Ultimately, Time Bandits was never intended to be neat. It was noisy, chaotic, obstinately bizarre. A kid's adventure sewn together with grown-up satire, commanded by dwarves pilfering maps and pilfering scenes. It shouldn't have worked. Studios questioned it, critics questioned it, Gilliam almost lost it, but in some way it endured, and then it flourished. Now, it exists as a cult classic, handed down like the map itself from one fantasist to the next.